Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative, and he worked at the FEC, Federal Election Commission. What suggests to me that there was fraud are macro anomalies. I don't know about the nitty-gritty of voting like you do, but it's odd that there would be so many losses to the Democrats, and yet the head of the ticket loses. Even New Hampshire has changed its state house to Republican, and all these people then vote against the head of the ticket. It's possible, but there just seem to be. Steve Cortez just listed all the anomalies that we're expected to believe. Does that affect your view, or are you more in the micro?
I'm into both, because what you're talking about is a clue or an indication there may have been fraud or other problems in what's going on. It's just like the issue of, and look, this hasn't been confirmed, but there are reports that there were many, many ballots received in some jurisdictions that only had one vote on it, the vote in the presidential race. And that seems very, very questionable. There's no question that there's drop-off on ballot. People tend to vote for the highest offices, the president, Congress, the Senate, et cetera. And then as they get down the ballot, because ballots are pretty long in a lot of places, and they get down to, local dog catcher, they don't vote for those. But to ignore an entire ballot and just vote for the presidential the presidential race, that seems kind of unusual, and it makes me suspicious that,
where were those ballots?
Ballots?
What state or city were those ballots?
Well, that's the thing. There are. I've seen some allegations that happened in Pennsylvania and maybe elsewhere, but again, that hasn't been confirmed. And it seems to me that kind of information we ought to confirm and investigate that before we certify the election.
So you'd have to do a recount. You'd have to count how many ballots in Pennsylvania only have a presidential vote, and even that doesn't prove fraud. It suggests
it suggests it. And remember, we have the additional problem in Pennsylvania of ballots being included in the count, absentee ballots that were received after the state-imposed deadline for the receipt of absentee ballots that was extended by the state Supreme Court. And you have the Trump campaign saying under the Constitution, the state Supreme Court did not have the authority to do that.
Would you abolish absentee ballots?
No, I think they're necessary for people who are sick or too disabled.
Right, but you do acknowledge that is very susceptible to manipulation.
It is, and that's why you need to have, first of all, I don't believe in no-fault absentee, which some states have moved to. I think you should have an excuse to vote by absentee. And second, you've got to put in security measures like the requirement that a witness sign and witness your signature on the ballot. And frankly, every state ought to do what Alabama, Kansas, Wisconsin have done, which is to put in an ID requirement for absentee ballots.
Would you abolish, well, let me drop that term. When would you allow people to start voting? How much before Election Day?
I sure wouldn't do it 6 weeks or 2 months ahead of time. Maybe a month before the election at the most. But again, I would restrict absentee ballots also just to people who have a valid excuse for why they can't be in the polls.
Right, but why, even if they have a valid excuse, I would even think 4 weeks is too much. I think Election Day should be Election Day, with very few exceptions.
Well, I agree with you, with the only real exception being
the disabled who can't show up.
Well, yeah, but also remember our overseas military.
Right. Okay. Fine. Okay.
And they need a longer.
Then only they should have the longer. Only they should have the longer then.
Des, I would have no problem with.
Right, I understand. No, I understand you wouldn't. Okay, I just want to repeat that my first question to you, and I'm not asking you to revise it, in light of all the likelihoods that you've described of fraud, you are still agnostic as to whether there was enough to have rendered Joe Biden president.
Right, because the only way to figure that out is to do a very complete and thorough investigation, and so far that hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, but what you said to me suggests that a thorough investigation is A, extremely lengthy, and B, probably not even possible, because how do we know that ballots were falsely filled?
Well, yes, you're exactly right.
Right.
Look, that's why it's hard to detect this after an election. You have to try to put measures in place before elections to deter and prevent this kind of stuff.
I changed the subject because of a break. We're talking about Pennsylvania.
Right.
Is there an argument that Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, for example, had different criteria, and yes, okay, that's what I thought you were suggesting.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, got a lot more. Unfortunately, this is it's Orwellian for the New York Times to say this is an attack on democracy rather than the fraud being an attack on the democracy.